Hello, it's Amy, and I'm back again with a chapter of the Memoirs of the Princesse de Ligne. And we are on chapter 2 here, where I think we're actually going to get into some of the princess's own words, so her own writing here. The first chapter was I believe entirely written by the editor of this English translation, Lucien Perry. So here we are on chapter 2. But it is time to let the little princess describe in her own ingenious and charming language the details of her admission to the Abbaye aux Bois. She pompously heads her copybook with the following title, which we reproduce as it stands in the original. Memoirs of Apolline Hélène Massalska in the Royal Abbey de Notre-Dame-aux-Bois, Rue de Sèvres, Faubourg Saint-Germain. I was received on a Thursday at the Abbaye aux Bois. Madame Geoffrin, my uncle's friend, took me first to the abbess's parlour, which is very handsome, for it is painted with white with gold stripes. Madame de Rochart came to the parlour also, and also Mother Quatre-Temps, but she is the head mistress of the youngest class to which I am to belong. They were kind enough to say I had a pretty face and a good figure and beautiful hair. I made no reply, having quite forgotten my French on the way, for it had been such a long journey that I had passed through I do not know how many towns, and always by coach, the driver blowing his horn all the time. I understood, however, all that was said. They then told me they were going to take me away to put me in the scholar's dress, and that when they would bring me back to the greeting for Madame Geoffrin to see me. They therefore opened the wicket of the parlour grating and passed me through it, as I was so small. I wonder what that means. They opened the wicket of the parlour grating and passed me through it. Because my mind, when I think of grating, I immediately think of heating, and I'm pretty sure they're not passing her through the fireplace. But I guess there must be some sort of grating in the wall that she is small enough to pass through. Whatever purpose that grating was for, maybe it was to let heat from a fireplace in one room pass to, another room. But yeah, they passed her through the grating in a wall. They brought me to a room belonging to the Lady Abbess, all hung in blue and white damask, and Sister Crenoir put me on the dress. But when I saw that it was black, I cried so very hard. It was quite piteous to see me. But when they added the blue ribbons, I was a little comforted, and then the headmistress brought me some preserves, which I ate, and I was told we should be given some every day. I was petted a good deal, and the elder of the young ladies on the service at the abbatial came to look at me, and I heard them say, "Poor little child, she does not speak French. We must make her speak Polish to see what kind of a language it is." But I, knowing they would laugh at me, did not choose to speak. They said I was very delicate, and then said I came from a very distant country, from Poland, adding, "Ah, how comical to be a Pole." However, Mademoiselle de Montmorency took me on her knee and asked if she should be a little mother, and I answered by a nod. For I was quite determined only to speak when I could speak like everybody else. I was asked if I thought the young lady holding me pretty, so I put my hands to my eyes to show that I thought hers were beautiful, and then they amused themselves in trying to make me say her name, Montmorency. However, I was told that my uncle had come to the parlour and wished to see me in uniform. I therefore went, dressed as I was, and it was thought that it suited me very well, and having well recommended me to the ladies, my uncle and Madame Geoffrin left. Then the Lady Abbess and Madame de Rochart tried to make me converse, but found it quite impossible, so that Madame de Rochart called to Madame de Montmorency and said, "Dear heart, I recommend this child to your care. She is a little foreigner, knowing hardly any French. You have a kind heart. Take her to the school, and see that she is not teased. It will be easy for you to have her well received." But when it came to giving my name, Madame de Rochart never could remember it. I repeated it, but seeing that it was thought ridiculous, I proposed it should not in future be mentioned. When Madame de Rochart asked me if I had not a Christian name, I said Helene. So Mademoiselle de Montmorency said she would introduce me under the name of Helene. That's kind of sad that she has to go by, I guess her Christian name would be, her Francophised name, or the name that she was baptized under. We started off, it was the recreation time. Mademoiselle de Narbonne, who had seen me at the abbatial, had already announced me. She had said I was a little wild thing, who had not chosen to open her lips, but that I was very graceful. As it was raining that day, the recreation was taking place in All Souls cloisters. As soon as I arrived, they all came towards us. Mademoiselle de Montmorency brought me to the teachers, who made a great deal of me, and the class surrounded me, asking all sorts of queer questions to which I did not reply, so that some of them thought I was dumb. Mademoiselle de Montmorency asked the headmistress of the blue class to be allowed to show me all over the departments in the convent. Mother Quatre-Temps consented. Then she took me through the whole house and gave me a good coalition. All the nuns and scholars of the red class petted me extremely. They gave me pincushions, soufflés. There's a footnote here telling us that a soufflé, Soufflets, is a small pincushion in the shape of bellows. Grimaces, Grimaces, a thick round box with pincushion top. So they gave her several kinds of pincushions, and I was very happy. At supper time, Mademoiselle de Montmorency brought me back to the classroom, and Mother Quatre-Temps led me to the hand of the refectory. I was given a seat next to Mademoiselle de Choiseul, who was the last arrival. During supper, Mademoiselle de Choiseul talked to me, and I risked a few words in answer, so that she called out, "The little Pole speaks French." After supper, I became quite intimate with Mademoiselle de Choiseul, who was very pretty. She told me that, when in the evening our names were called over, I must ask Madame de Rochart for a holiday and give a coalition, and that she would do the speaking. Then we played at many games, the Massacre of the Innocents and 1,000 other things. And I wish there was a footnote there. There's no footnote there. Apparently they just expect us as the reader to know what the Massacre of the Innocents game is. I'll have to Google that later and see if there's any information about that. I'm assuming it probably has some sort of religious connotation to it. When it was bedtime, we went to the nuns' dormitory. Madame de Rochart read the roll call. I was called last. I came forward with Madame de Choiseul, who in my name begged for a holiday. Madame de Rochart inquired from Madame Quatre-Temps if my uncle had been informed of what was necessary to pay for the welcome, as it was called, for it cost 25 louis, or £20 at the time of the publication in 1887 here. To give a grand coalition to all the pupils, and ices were absolutely necessary. Mother Quatre-Temps said yes, so the following Saturday was chosen for the holiday. And so they seem to be using holiday here as a party, a day or an afternoon that you take off to have a party. It is easy to see by this opening scene that the little Pole would soon get accustomed to her new life. And this is our editor interjecting again into Helene's story. The blue class into which Helene was entered was composed of children from 7 to 10 years old. And we have another footnote. Children from 5 to 7 years of age did not attend school, but there was a considerable number of them at the Abbaye aux Bois under the care of the younger nuns. It is interesting to note from the very first what was the order of the lessons, the working and recreation hours. Helene gives it to us in her own writing. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, to get up in summer at 7 o'clock, in winter at 7:30, to be at 8 in the stalls of the schoolroom, ready for Madame de Rochart, who comes in at 8, Directly she has left to learn the Catechisme du Montpellier and repeat it. And we have a footnote. The Catechisme du Montpellier was a Jainist catechism. Its doctrines were openly proclaimed by the ladies of the Abbaye aux Bois. At 9 o'clock breakfast, and at 9:30 Mass. At 10, reading till 11. From 11 till 11:30, a music lesson. At 11:30 till 12, drawing lessons. From 12 to 1, a lesson in geography and history. At 1 o'clock, dinner and recreation till 3. At 3 o'clock, lessons in writing and arithmetic till 4. At 4 o'clock, dancing lesson till 5. Coalition and recreation till 6. From 6 to 7, the harp or the harpsichord. And the translator keeps using this term coalition, C-O-L-L-A-T-I-O-N. And so it seems to mean some sort of socializing, some sort of coming together. I know the term, coalition in modern Canadian English is meaning we only really use it when we talk about a coalition where two sides come together and decide to govern together. And so maybe it's just perhaps the staff of this school and the children are together in one room, or perhaps all the students from the various grades come together to play, but it does seem to mean some sort of socializing. The alternate days were arranged in the same manner, but instead of receiving lessons from masters unconnected with the convent, the children studied under the superintendence of the ladies of the abbey. On Sundays and holy days, these latter being very numerous, the classes met at 8 o'clock, the gospel was read, and then all went to Mass at 9. At 11, the young girls attended a short lesson given by the directors, and at 4 o'clock went to vespers. Helene was not admitted to portray the mistresses of the blue class. Has not omitted to portray the mistresses of the blue class, and has sketched them with irreverent precision. Madame de Montluc, called Mother Quatre-Temps, kind, gentle, careful, 2 minutes, and a busybody. Madame de Montboucher, called Saint Macaire, kind, stupid, very ugly, believing in ghosts. Madame de Frasnes, called Saint Bathilde, ugly and kind, tells us many stories. 15 lay sisters perform the service of the blue class. Though Helene belonged to the youngest class, she had been temporarily placed in the dormitory of the elder girls, a source of great displeasure to them, as we shall soon see. About this time I began to fall ill from the effects of the Paris water. Monsieur Portal ordered me some powders, and then I was in bed. Madame de Saint Bathilde, the third mistress of the blue class, used to come with a lay sister in order to make me take them. And we have a footnote here about the consulting physician, which apparently was a physician to a number of sovereigns and a professor of anatomy at, it just says, the museum, president of the Academy of Medicine, and a friend of Buffon and Franklin. His long career was devoted to remarkable works. By command of the Academy of Sciences, he drew up a report in 1774 on the effects of noxious fumes, amongst others of coal, on man. This small work was reprinted several times and translated into 4 languages at the expense of the Academy. Although the least important, it is best known of all his works. He died in 1832, aged 87. And I wonder if that was quite common back in this day. You would get used to, drinking the water, which I expect was not anywhere near as, cleaned and processed as our modern city water. As you get used to drinking the public water available in certain towns and cities, the groundwater, and then your whole gut microbiome would be thrown off if you suddenly started drinking water elsewhere. And I've noticed that myself going from city to city. The water will taste a little bit different, and you might have, a little bit of a queasy stomach for a day or two while you acclimate yourself to whatever the vibe of that current water is. But she was sick. And she says, on one occasion, Madame de Saint Bathilde and the lay sister forgot to give them to me, and on this day the elder girls were going to eat a pasty, and when the door was locked they got up and began to eat by the glimmer of a street lamp. When I saw they were eating, I said I wanted some, and that if they did not give me any, I should tell. So she's a little tattletale. No wonder they didn't like her. Upon which Mademoiselle de Equilly brought me a large piece of pie and crust, which I devoured. But Madame de Saint Bathilde remembered that she had not given me my powder, and got out of bed and brought it to me. No sooner did the young ladies hear the key in the lock than they all ran to their beds, and one of them put all the fragments of the pasty into her bed. Then the mistress and sister Ali came to my side to give me my powder. As I did not dare to say anything for fear of betraying the girls, I was obliged to swallow the powder, having just eaten a large piece of pie crust. When Madame de Saint Bathilde was gone, the girls got up again. They grumbled at me, saying it was insupportable to have a tiresome brat like myself in their room, and then they set to and drank some cider. I called out again for some to be given to me, but they would not, because I had just taken a powder, and even Mademoiselle de Roche Amon came and slapped me. But I cried so much that at last they were obliged to give me a glass of cider, which I drank off at one draught. Next morning I had violent fever, and I was carried to the infirmary. In the night I was delirious, and a putrid fever came on. I was at death's door, and remained 2 months at the infirmary. And so you have to wonder, is it something in the water that she didn't have an immunity to, some sort of virus, or bacteria that she wasn't used to? Or, what kind of powder were they giving her? It's quite possible the powder made her sick. After this fine freak, the health of the little princess was considered too delicate for her to undergo the usual education. It was therefore decided to give her separate rooms, a nurse, a maid, and a M-I-E, a nursery maid, her uncle having written to authorize in advance all necessary expenses. My nurse, she continues, was called Bathilde Toutevoix, and soon idolized me. I was given a very fine apartment, allowed 4 louis a month for my pocket money, and nothing was denied me for my keep and my master's. Mr. Turton, my banker, received an order from my uncle to supply me up to the sum of 30,000 livres a year, if necessary. And we have a footnote here. So her allowance in 1887 terms was about £3, and the amount from the baker, the 30,000 livres, was about £1,200 in 1887. And if anyone, wants to put in the comments if they've done the calculations what this would be in today's money, that would be kind of neat to see. The footnote for the £1,200 also says, we must not lose sight of the fact that at the Abbaye aux Bois, the education was exclusively devoted to forming future great ladies and differed entirely from that of the middle class. And so this is certainly a luxurious and wealthy existence. About that time, my nurse became very cross with me. We had a cat that was very fond of my nurse and even of me, but whatever I did to it, it never scratched me, though I often put it sufficiently out of temper to make it growl like a mad thing. This cat was called La Grise. Once Mademoiselle de Choiseul and myself were eating some walnuts at the end of the passage leading to the older part of the building. We had seated ourselves on some steps there, and when, unfortunately, La Grise passed by, I called it, and it came to us, and while stroking it, the idea came into our heads to fasten the nutshells on its paws. Oh, that's cruel. Mademoiselle de Choiseul had some ribbon in her netting box, so we carried out our plan, and La Grise was so funny, for it could not stand up. We laughed so loud that my nurse and Madame de Saint Monique heard us from my room. They came downstairs and found La Grise in this condition. My nurse nearly cried. She scolded me very much and sent me to the schoolroom. But that was not all. La Grise always slept at the foot of my bed because my nurse thought it would keep me warm. That evening, when my nurse had gone to bed, being cross with La Grise for having got me into disgrace, I began kicking it so much that it got off my bed. So she is not kind to animals at all. That's kind of cruel to kick the cat out of bed. after, you tortured it, and now you're blaming the cat. Then it went to lie down in the fireplace. After a few minutes, I put my head out of my curtains to see what it was about, but when I saw its 2 eyes glistening in the fireplace, I was frightened, and thought that if I awoke in the night and saw those eyes, I should not know where they were. So I got out of bed, took it up, and not knowing where to put it, gently opened the press and shut it inside. Then the poor Grise began to mew and moan so loud that my nurse got up, not knowing what it could be. She looked about everywhere and at last discovered Le Grise in the press. I was so silly that I maintained I had not put the cat there, and that apparently had got in by itself. My nurse said, as that was the way I hated Le Grise, she would give it away the very next day. As you should, give the cat to someone who's going to look after it and care for it. Then I cried so much and screamed so loud that Mademoiselle de Choiseul, Mesdemoiselles de Conflans, my maid and their maids, ran into the room not knowing what could have happened. I told them I was the most unhappy person in the world, that my nurse wanted to give away Le Grise, that I could not live without it, and that I would have Le Grise. It must be given me at once, and I would beg its pardon. I had no rest till Le Grise was put on my bed. I took it in my arms, I embraced it, I kissed its paws, and I promised it I would never do it again. Then my nurse said she consented to keep Le Grise, but that I would have nothing but dry bread for breakfast next day. I was only too happy to be let off so easily. They all went back to their rooms, and I slept quietly the remainder of the night. Soon after, Helene was brought to the confessional for the first time. Though only 8 years old, she followed the religious instructions for some days, and Dom Thamines, the pupil's director, enjoined on her a religious retreat to meditate on obedience, a very good subject for a mischievous child. After the retreat, she confessed, but unfortunately has left us no record of her confession. Well, I hope she confessed about the cat. She came back rather tired, but satisfied with her day's work, and thinking herself quite a grown-up person. She continues her narrative with charming ingenuousness. In the evening, Sister Bichon came to see my nurse, and while Mademoiselle Giolle, my maid, was undressing me, Sister Bichon begged me to remember her in my prayers, for although I said them with the others in the schoolroom, I was made to repeat them before getting into bed. I said to Sister Bichon, "What do you wish me to ask God Almighty for you?" She replied, "Pray to God that he may make my soul as pure as yours is at this moment." I therefore said out loud at the end of my prayer, "My God, grant Sister Bichon that her soul may be as white as mine ought to be at my age, if I had profited by the good teaching I have received." My nurse was delighted at the manner in which I had arranged my prayer, and kissed me, as did also Sister Bichon, Mademoiselle Giolle, and me, Claudine. When I was in bed, I asked if it was a sin to pray for Le Grise. My nurse and Sister Bichon replied yes, and that I must not speak to God about Le Grise. And so that's an interesting point of view. Then, as I was not sleepy, Sister Bichon came to my bedside and told me that if I died that night, I should go immediately into paradise. Then I asked her what one saw in paradise. She replied, "You must imagine, my little darling, that paradise is a large room, all made of diamonds and rubies and emeralds and other precious stones. God Almighty sits on the throne. Jesus Christ is on his right hand, and the Blessed Virgin is on his left. The Holy Ghost is perched on his shoulder, and all the saints pass and repass before him." While she was telling me this, I fell asleep. There is always a certain truth and simplicity about the little princess's narrative, which lends it a great charm. She praises and blames herself with entire good faith, and her character becomes apparent at the end of a few pages. The education in common and the intelligent management of Madame de Rouchart had an excellent influence on this spoilt and wayward child, accustomed to see everything give way before her. But she had to suffer at the beginning, and she relates her first experiences in a most comical manner. "I had at that time," she says, "a terrible aversion for good handwriting. Monsieur Carme was very much displeased with me, and set me back to write nothing but O's, which bored me very much, and at the same time the whole class laughed at me. They said I should never be able to sign my own name. It was not that I absolutely hated writing. On the contrary, I spent the whole day writing my memoirs, as was the fashion among the elder young ladies at that time, and we, the younger class, chose to do the same. I therefore scribbled all day long, but it was such a scrawl that only I could read it, and far from benefiting me, it spoilt my hand. Mademoiselle de Choiseul often wrote for me, but as they perceived it was not my writing, Monsieur Carme complained of me to Mother Quatre-Temps. She asked me, "Mademoiselle, is it you who have written this?" I answered, "Yes, madame, in truth it is." She said, "If it is you, write out at once before me a similar page." Then I was very much embarrassed. I should have liked to have got into a mouse hole. What I wrote worst were the M's and N's, and my copy was Massinicia, Roi du Numidi. As everyone knows, there are a great many tops and tails in that name. And there they were all airy, one going one way, one going another. In short, it was easy to see that I was incapable of making such a copy. Then Mother Quatre-Temps fastened donkey ears on me, and because I had told falsehoods, hung a red tongue together with my copy on my back. I began saying that I wrote so badly because the table had been shaken. I was told that I slandered, and the black tongue was added. The worst of it was that Madame du Rouchart, who was rather pleased with me and was beginning to show me much kindness, had told me at the morning class to go to her cell that evening at 6. But now the hour was approaching. How could I make my appearance in the state I was in? I would sooner have died. Was I presentable with donkey's ears, 2 tongues, and a tattered scrawl on my back? So when Mother Quatre-Temps told me to go to the Maîtresse Générale, I would not leave my place, and I cried enough to make my eyes start out of my head. Mademoiselle de Choiseul was also crying, and all my class pitied me. When Mother Quatre-Temps saw I would not obey her, she added into the bargain the order of ignominy and sent for 2 lay sisters, Sister Aloy and Sister Bichon, who took me by the arms, dragged me from my stall, and conducted me to the door of Madame du Rochot's cell. This does not sound like a very pleasant school to go to, but I suppose this was, a somewhat normal form of punishment in schools in these days. When I arrived there, I was so wretched that I felt my life was not worth a pin. Directly I entered, Madame de Rochot called out and said, "Eh, my heavens, what has happened to you? You look like a Merry Andrew. What can you have done to deserve being deprived of your human figure?" Then I threw myself at her feet and told her my faults. I saw she had the greatest difficulty in the world to keep herself from laughing. However, she said in a severe manner, "Your faults are very great, and your punishment is not great enough." Then she called in the 2 sisters who were at the door and said, "I order Mademoiselle to be reconducted to the schoolroom and to go without dessert for 8 days, and tell the headmistress of the blue class to come and speak to me." Madame de Rouchard, moreover, asked if I had met anyone on my way to her, and said I had met the doctor, Monsieur Bordeaux, and Madame la Duchesse de Chatillon, who had come to see one of her daughters who was sick. I was brought back to the classroom, but I heard shortly after some of the red class young ladies say that Madame de Rouchart had said it was stupid to make such a guy of me, and that she had soundly rated Mother Quatre-Temps, requesting her to punish her scholars without disfiguring them. That a few days before she had entered the schoolroom and thought she must be looking at Egyptian idols on seeing 5 or 6 of us, with asses' ears and 3 tongues, and as the convent was constantly full of strangers, it might throw a ridicule on the education of the pupils. From that time forth, these punishments were abolished, and instead we were made to go on our knees in the middle of the choir. We were deprived of dessert, given dry bread at breakfast, and coalition was made to copy out the privilege de roi during playtime, which was very tedious. And the privilege de roi, a preface authorizing the publication of a work granted in the king's name, the privilege de roi. And so I guess that would be when you would open up a book and it would say, this was authorized for publication by the king, because of course these were the days of pretty heavy censorship in most European countries in terms of what could and could not be printed. And I know in some countries, including France, you had to have authorization to print certain things, and if you tried without that authorization, there was a chance that you could get yourself into some legal troubles. Helene was, however, not at the end of her tribulations, and her quick temper naturally brought her into a few more. About that time I experienced from all the class a bodily punishment which I resolved long to remember. I was in the habit of repeating to Madame de Saint Euphrasie everything that took place in the class, and as I saw it met with success, I listened to all the pupils, all that was said, so as to repeat it to her so much so that all the classes had taken a dislike to me. And so she really was a tattletale. No wonder her classmates didn't like her. I was at that time 9 years of age. I had a quarrel with Mademoiselle du Nagu. She had taken from my drawer the short lives of the saints with pictures in it, and was reading it. As I only allowed my most intimate friends to rummage in my drawer, I went to her and told her to return me my book. She said, "This book amuses me. You do not want to read it just now. I will return it when I have finished it." I was not satisfied with this answer and tried to snatch it away from her. But, as she was stronger than I, she gave me a sound box in the ear. Then, instead of giving her one in return, I began to cry and went to complain to Madame de Saint Pierre, head mistress of the white class, as Nagu belonged to that class. The mistress, seeing me in tears and my cheek red, called Mademoiselle de Nagu and desired her to return me my book, to ask my pardon, and condemned her to go without dessert at supper. Everyone pitied Nagu, the more so that I was not liked. Everyone called me Telltale and hummed in my ear, "Telltale tit, go and tell our cat to keep a place for you the day that you die." And I'm sure that sounds much more like a rhyme in the original French. Telltale tit. And so I suppose that is the earlier iteration of the tattletale rhyme that was repeated on many a playground in my childhood. But that was not all. Mademoiselle de Choiseul and Mesdemoiselles de Conflans, my 3 friends, were absent. Mademoiselle de Choiseul was being inoculated. The others were in the country, so that I had no one to uphold me. On leaving the refectory, it is the custom to run as fast as possible to the schoolroom, the mistresses, meanwhile, remaining behind. Instead of remaining with them, for then no one would have touched me, I was silly enough to be one of the first to run. I unluckily found myself next to Nagu, who said, "Ah, I have caught you," and at the same moment tripped me up and threw me down on my face. Then all the young ladies began jumping over my body, so that I received so many kicks, and I was bruised all over. The mistresses came to me, and I was picked up, and the young ladies said, "Mademoiselle, I beg your pardon, I never saw you." Others said to the mistresses, who scolded them, "I did not do it on purpose. She was on the ground. I did not see her." I was sent to bed, and the next day Madame de Rouchart came to me. I told her my story, and she said, "If your companions loved you, this would never have happened. You must have great faults of character for all the class to be against you." Since that day, I have never repeated the least thing to my mistresses, and I became so amiable that everyone loved me, and Nagu also, with whom I became such friends that we would have gone through fire and water for each other. But now is the moment to speak of the game that was most in fashion at the Abbaye aux Bois. It was the chase, but it required a whole day to carry it out, and it could only be played in the garden. They elected huntsmen and whippers in. Then they chose those who were to be the deer, and marked one stag to lead. The younger class were the hounds, and the red class always went very politely and asked the blue class to take that part in the game. When we were not pleased with the red class, we refused, and even sometimes it has happened that in the middle of the game, the blues would leave, go away, so that the stag could not be run down. I had then an adventure for which I revenged myself well. Among the older girls of the red class, there was a Mademoiselle de Sivrac, who had a very handsome face, but was subject to spasms, and was rather crazy. We had had our recreation in the garden, and as we were returning to the schoolroom, she said to me, I have forgotten my gloves at the end of the garden. Please come with me to fetch them." I innocently accompanied her, but when we were behind the lilac bush, she threw herself upon me, upset me, seized a branch of lilac, and whipped me cruelly. When she had beaten me well, she ran away. I picked myself up as best I could and returned crying to the classroom. I thought, if I complain to the mistresses, Mademoiselle de Servac will deny the fact. She will say she only gave me a few slaps, and I shall again be thought a telltale. What should I do? I called together all the most determined girls in the blue class and told them my story, adding that if they did not revenge me, the blue class would soon be overpowered by the older pupils. In fact, I stirred up their feelings as best I could, so that we declared we would have no farther intercourse with the red class until Mademoiselle de Servac made an apology. On the first holiday after this, the red class wished to play at the chase. They sent to beg the blue class to lend them some girls to act as hounds, but no one would go, and it was the same for all the other games. Then they asked what was the meaning of brats like us being so stuck up. In reality, they were very annoyed, for the red class is the least numerous, the white class is taken up with preparing for their first communion, so that we were absolutely necessary for any games requiring a large number. This was not all. We broke open Madame de Servac's drawer and stall, tore into atoms all her papers, and threw into the well her purse, a pocket-book, and a comfit box that we also found in it. Then the red young ladies told Mesdemoiselles de Choiseul and du Monsage, who were the most infuriated because they were my friends, that if they caught them alone, they would box their ears. From this moment, there was the most fearful disorder in the schoolroom. Anything that was found belonging to the red class was thrown into the well or torn up by the blue class, and whenever the reds could catch the blues, they beat them like plaster. At last, all this became known to the mistresses, for at every moment the little ones were seen with marks of pinches, of scratches, and when asked, "Who put you in that state?" they replied, "The red young ladies." On the other hand, the older girls lost their books, found their copybooks torn, and their trinkets broken. The parents of both classes spoke to Madame de Rouchart, some saying that their daughters were covered with bumps and bruises, the others that their daughters had lost or had all their things torn up. When Madame de Rouchart came to the schoolroom and asked the blues and reds what had given rise to all this hatred, Madame de Choiseul came forward and related my affair with Mademoiselle de Servac. Madame de Rouchart asked her why she had whipped me, and she could give no reason. But, without Madame de Rouchart saying anything more to her, she came up to me, begged my pardon, and kissed me. Madame de Rouchart said that if these quarrels continued, the two classes would have to be entirely separated. And she commanded us to kiss each other. From that day, peace was re-established, and we no longer willingly hurt each other. One day, while running in the garden, we heard a subterranean noise and looked about to see where it could come from. At last, discovered that it issued from a drain hole which corresponded with the kitchen of the Comte du Beaumanor, whose mansion was next door. Thereupon, several of us formed a line to hide what we were doing from the mistresses, while the others began to talk. We heard a little boy's voice. We asked his name. He said it was Jacquot, and that he had the honour of serving in the Count du Beaumanor's kitchen. We told him the recreation hour was ending, but that we should return next day at the same hour. The following day he played the flute, and we sang. Then, as soon as one of us spoke, he asked our name. He was told it, and in 3 or 4 days he knew several by the sound of their voices, and called out, "Hello, de Aumont, Damas, Mortemart." He inquired if one was fair or dark, and then asked what we were doing in the garden. We told him it was our collation hour, and we replied that if it were not for an iron grating in the middle of the drain, he would be able to give us some dainty morsels. So we said he must try and remove the grating, and he promised to do his best. We were so taken up by our conversation that Madame de Saint-Pierre, one of the mistresses, was able to approach us without our noticing. When we saw her so near, we all ran away, and Jacquot cried out, "Listen, Choiseul, Damas, the grating shall be taken away tomorrow." Madame de Saint-Pierre went directly to Madame de Rouchart and told her what had happened. Madame de Rouchart wrote at once to Madame de Beaumanor, that the drain leading from his kitchen, or rather to Monsieur de Beaumanor, that the drain leading from his kitchen was going to be walled up as his servants talked with the scholars. He immediately replied that he was extremely vexed at what had happened, and that he was going to dismiss all his kitchen servants. Madame de Rochart begged he would not do so. The masons were sent for, and the drain walled up that very day. Madame de Rochart did not consider it worthwhile to come down to the schoolroom about such an adventure. On the contrary, she thought it would be attaching too much importance to it. But in the evening at the roll call, she made some jests about the delightful conquest we had made, and added that we must have very refined tastes and noble feelings to have set such store by a scullion's conversation. And that, as for those who had given him their names, she trusted he would at some future time take advantage of their former kindness, which would naturally be very pleasant for their families. This way she humbled without scolding us. Madame de Rochart, a woman of sound judgment and noble mind, soon became very tenderly attached to the little Pole. The child, almost abandoned so far from her own country, inspired her with real interest. Each day she had her brought to her cell, and without the child being aware of it, watched her carefully. Helene, who was a little wild colt, felt a respect and at the same time a sort of fear mingled with the greatest admiration of the Grande Maîtresse Générale. She constantly mentions her in her memoirs. Madame de Rochart, sister of the late Duc de Mortemart, was 27 years of age, tall, a handsome figure, a pretty foot, hands delicate and white, splendid teeth, large black eyes, a proud and grave look and bewitching smile. Such is the portrait the little princess has left us of her. She was undoubtedly, after the Lady Abbess, the most important person in the abbey, and directed as she chose the studies and education of the pupils. It was thus that she filled up the often tedious hours of a life and calling she had not chosen. Madame de Rochart had two sisters who were beautiful and witty like all the Mortemarts. All three went through their novitive when hardly 15 years old, for according to the cruel custom of those times, their fortunes were entirely to the inheritor of the family name. They pronounced their vows 3 years after. I stood in great fear of Madame de Rochart in those days, says Helene, when she came to the classroom in the morning and went the rounds. If by chance she spoke to me, I immediately became embarrassed and had trouble to collect myself sufficiently to reply. Indeed, it may be said that the whole class trembled before her, so that when she came in of a morning and we were all returning in confusion from breakfast, she would clap her hands and everyone would run to her stall, and one might have heard a fly. When we made our curtsy to her on entering the choir, I tried to read in her eyes, and if I thought her look severe, I was in despair. I had got the habit of tearing at full speed through the house, but when I met Madame de Rochart, I stopped dead short. Then, when she looked at me, as her customary gaze is naturally severe, I fancied I had displeased her, and returned to the schoolroom quite disheartened, saying, "Ah, Madame de Rochart has made big eyes at me." The others replied, "How silly you are! Do you expect her to make her eyes smaller when she meets you?" This was told by Madame de Rochart. The next time she saw me, she called me and laughingly asked me if she was looking at me the way I liked, and if her eyes were still very alarming. I answered that I had thought them so beautiful that they gave me more pleasure than fear, and she kissed me. She commands the love and respect of all the pupils, and though a little severe, is very just. We are all devoted to her, and yet fear her. She is not demonstrative, but a word from her has the most wonderful effect. She is accused of being proud and satirical to equals, but she is gracious and kind to her inferiors, very well informed and highly gifted. And that brings us to the end of chapter 2, and the sun has shifted. So I will be closing that curtain a little bit more directly.